Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and we're here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. And I am just thrilled and honored to be here with one of my favorite writers, one of the best humans that I know, Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren, as many of you know, is a prolific author. He's an activist and a public theologian. He's an international lecturer. He's written more than 15 books focused on faith. And just recently, he published, we were just talking about it, his first, I think, science fiction novel, The Last Voyage. And I've been reading this summer, and it is great. It's a great book. It's really inviting, intriguing. The characters are really interesting. It's fast paced. The science fiction is wonderful.
Mhm.
So just congratulations, Brian, and welcome back to Writing for Your Life, and Compassionate Christianity. And maybe before we dive into talking about the book in detail, you can just talk about sort of this lane change and the
Mhm.
acknowledgments you thanked your agent and others for supporting you as you changed lanes. And so, this is a big, there are a lot of themes of faith in this book, which I'm hoping we can talk about, but this is a big
Mhm.
change for you, I'm assuming. What
Yeah.
prompted your decision to write a science fiction novel,
Mhm.
and how has it been for you just, in this different genre?
Yeah. Well, the truth is, I was desperate for money, and I just did it all for the money. No, that's not it. Uh, well, first, I should say I'm so happy to be here with you, and I'm especially thinking about writing for your life listeners. Something that it might be helpful for them to know is that publishers do like writers to get in a lane and stay in it. It's kind of like branding, they want you to have a brand, and that's understandable. It's not great for a writer who wants to grow and branch out, so you have to work against that. Um, Unless you're very happy to stay in the lane, which some people are. Uh, I had a publisher once tell me, an editor once tell me, most writers just write the same book their whole lives. And I guess there's some sense that people have sort of a life message, and if that's what he meant by that, that makes sense. But uh, I I wrote a trilogy of fiction early in my career. It was called The New Kind of Christian, The Story We Find Ourselves In, and The Last Word in the Word After That. But it was very content heavy fiction. It sort of rode that line. Some people might call it creative nonfiction, or other people. There was a term I heard someone use once, hortatory fiction, meaning fiction that's supposed to help you or encourage you in some way. So anyhow, it was over on that side. And I've always wanted to get back to writing fiction. So 20 years away, it was time to come back. Part of it is I'm getting old enough that uh, it, I don't really care if they tell me you can't change lanes. I'll just, try to find somebody who'll publish it anyway. But part of it is this, Kate. Um, I think fiction it is a way of exploring things just the way nonfiction can be. Um, and the through line between these three books that will come out and my other nonfiction work is when I when I begin writing a nonfiction book, I start with a problem. I don't start with all the answers. And my writing process is my way of exploring possible answers. What that means is I I turn in a book proposal, but I don't think any book I've ever written turned out very much like the book proposal because that's my best guess when I'm starting. But once you get into the work, you find different rabbit trails that you have to follow, or you find that that approach isn't going to work. So it's really an exploratory process. Some people call it a discovery process for me when I write nonfiction. And I felt very much like that in this situation. I wanted to project current trends, the way things are going in the world, uh, out 30 years and um, and imagine that world and imagine what people might be doing in that world. And I didn't have a whole plot diagram of everything figured out when I started. I just wanted to put a couple of characters I liked in an environment and then see what would happen.
Well, congratulations, because it's really successful. You're such a fabulous writer, and it's fun to see that applied to the genre of fiction and specifically science fiction. As I mentioned, I'm a big sci-fi fan, and so this is really just from from artistic perspective is beautifully done. So congratulations.
Well, I really appreciate that from you, Kate. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, that this is sort of an expl has been your all of your writing is exploratory, but I wonder if having these characters that are so diverse and sort of exemplify different perspectives gives you even more freedom to explore and to
Hmm.
to put voice to different parts of your own inner exploration. Would you
Yeah,
would you say that's true?
yeah, very, very much so. Obviously, there's the kind of negative imagination of saying, if, for example, if we're in the habit now of electing oligarchs, and if we're in the habit now of saying we would rather see our nation as a business than as a nation, um, where will that lead? And playing that out is, and what could possibly go wrong? I'm playing that out, I think, helps me as a human being wondering what's going to happen. And I'm certainly not saying I'm predicting the future. I'm just imagining one scenario of how these things could unfold. I sure hope I'm not predicting the future. But that also goes for what would happen if you had a couple of oligarchs who they've got a whole lot of money, a whole lot of power, and they're being pressured by their fellow oligarchs to sort of join the club and play the game, and they have a crisis of conscience. That's not who they are. That's not what they want to do. And so there are two characters who, in my mind, decide to do something uh, of what a good oligarch might do, who decides to not play that game anymore and try to do something for the good of humanity, and not only humanity, but the good of life on the planet. Um, and uh, and then there's the two of the main characters are a father named Colfax, who's kind of a hard-nosed left-brain scientist who's whose whole life has been a reaction against religion and superstition and all that sort of thing. And then his daughter, who rebels and does the a predictable thing, she becomes a spiritually oriented person. And so watching that tension, I feel like all of the atheists who hate religion, I really am 100% with them in the critique of what's wrong with religion. And the people who feel that religion's super important because it's the one place where we ask some of the most important questions, I'm all with those people. So I got to play out those dramas and many others as well. Maybe I'll add one other, Kate, and that is the story is framed on a voyage to Mars, a set of voyages to Mars where people go one way, and it's people. These oligarchs are setting up an assurance colony, a colony to try to assure survival because they're genuinely afraid that human beings will self-destruct. And uh, and they intentionally choose people of different races and nationalities, and because they're trying to create a good gene pool to begin this this new experiment. Well, that creates questions about how are people going to get along, and this is one of the questions all of us are facing. Are we going to regress into these homogenous, uh, somewhat racist and bigoted uh, uh, ethnic corners where we see each other as enemies, or are we going to try to imagine coming together with our cultural, religious, educational, professional differences?
Well, thank you for that. And so, as you mentioned, there's the plot line is this colony on Mars and the last voyage that's going to happen. And you mentioned the characters of Colfax and Eve, and I really wanted to ask you about religion as a theme in this book, because in many ways, this there's so much impressive, classic science fiction, the technical. I want to
Mhm.
ask you too, how did you get your technical knowledge straight for this? But, I could see you as a faith-based writer in the pages of this book because religion and spirituality is a theme throughout and exemplified really in that father-daughter relationship. So can you just say a little bit more about that and sort of what you were hoping to explore and what maybe fiction allowed you to do that you wouldn't be able to do in a nonfiction?
Mm.
space.
Well, let me tell a quick story about when I wrote A New Kind of Christian 25 years ago. Uh, I was A New Kind of Christian was going to be a nonfiction book, and I was writing the book, and I think I had about 80,000 words, and I was like 20% through my outline, and I thought this book is going to be so long nobody will ever read it. And someone had said somewhat critically about one of my earlier books, if McLaren really means what he's writing about, he should be writing poetry and fiction and theater. And that came back to me, and I thought, as a nonfiction writer, I have to answer every question that my ideal reader would ask. But if I'm writing fiction, I only have to answer this person has to answer the question this character would ask. So it felt like it was a way for me to make things less general and more particular. And and I think that the challenge in our world today between people who feel that technology, that science has all the answers and that religion is an outdated, superstitious excuse for authoritarians and con artists to control the masses. Look, they have data to support them in that. But if they win, I think we'll end up with another set of problems. Um, just a little footnote on that. I'm really talking like a writer since I'm talking to you because here's a footnote. I was in Charlottesville in 2017 as part of the clergy response to the neo-Nazi and fascist rally there. And uh, I was interested in reading everything I could that people were writing about those incredibly ugly days. And one writer said, who is an expert in right-wing ideology, said, if you think that right-wing religion is bad, wait until you see the secular right wing, because he'd spent months and years immersing himself, researching kind of the secular right wing. So at any rate, there's that side of it that I wanted to explore with Colfax. And then his daughter, she's not representing traditional religion because for her, that's also a non-option. She's trying to imagine what could work going forward. And so they're both living in kind of the aftermath of a certain kind of religion that is in the midst of discrediting itself now. And I imagine 30 years it will have gone much farther. And then what will the people do who do not want to follow that discrediting? What will they do differently? That's the kind of question that Eve would be asking.
Mm. Well, and you mentioned I mean, what I love about Eve is that she's this mixture of, right, an ethicist, a theologian, a philosopher. She's an expert in comparative religion. So I hear what you're saying, which is that she represents this kind of maybe new sensibility or
Mm.
emerging. Well, in addition to sort of faith and religion being an explicit theme in the book, there's obviously the backdrop to this novel is so much about the ecological
Yeah,
crises of the time that, as you say, have sort of extrapolated from our current time. But also mental health
yeah.
is really a theme in a very explicit and somewhat surprising way to me. So maybe can you talk about sort of again
Yeah.
those two themes and how you see them intersecting and sort of how you wanted to explore them in this novel?
So, Kate, I'm so glad you asked that. You're the first person who's asked me that question in that way. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to go there is because I think one of the things we're seeing in our world right now is a kind of, people have talked about mass psychosis or a neurotic society. I think there's ways that a whole nation or civilization or religion or political affiliation can develop its own kind of group mental illness. And let me give two examples of where I think if people look in the headlines, they'll start to see this every day. Uh, I don't mean this in a pejorative way because I have in my family, there's a lot of mental illness. And as a pastor, I've dealt with mental illness so much. I spent an hour on the phone with a person today who was reaching out to me who's in a mental health crisis. So I do not see mental illness as a stigma at all. I just see it as a fact of life. Um, I think billionaires have a certain kind of mental illness that they develop, a set of delusions, a set of illusions, more and more layers between them and the actual reality of the world. They live in such an intense reality of money and an intense reality of social climbing to be in some certain strata that the world looks different to them. Um, uh, and I think we're seeing that. We're seeing people who we think would be very, very smart, and watching them do things that show an incredible lack of judgment and foresight, and even being fully in touch with reality. And sometimes those things can become very, very self-destructive. But I think there's another form of it that's going on with fossil fuels. People and our whole the way we live with the earth. We suck out more from the earth than the earth can replenish. We pump out more waste into the earth and the earth can detoxify. Any person with two brain cells to rub together sees that is not a good way to build a future. And yet, a significant percentage of people, especially people in power, are able to just treat that as if it weren't reality. And the only reason they can do that, I think, is because they see some other realities, things like profit and return on investment and things like this, that are more real to them than the air they breathe and how the world actually works. All of that's to say, I think the issue of the mental health of whole civilizations is of interest to me, and I'm trying to play that out in some of the drama of what's happening on Earth, and something that's happening, but just at a faster speed on Mars.
Yeah, and that's what really got me was sort of the way mental health is playing out on Mars. I thought your treatment of that was really unique and compelling and sort of, terrifying in a way. So yeah, I'm grateful that you are exploring these themes because I do think they are pressing for many people and becoming more, more of an epidemic all the time. So well, I do just have sort of a nerdy question, which is,
Mhm.
as I was reading the book and knowing you a little bit, and there was many things about the book that didn't surprise me in terms of being within your wheelhouse or your realm of expertise, like, Colfax's extremely substantial knowledge of birds and his huge vocabulary. And I could see your playfulness coming out in that. But then there was also just this really technical side sort of that is part of, most sci-fi books. And so I'm just curious how you picked that up. I'm sure I know you're extremely well read, of course, but are you a sci-fi fan yourself? And is
I
this
am,
kind
yeah.
of, in the air you breathe, or did you have to really stretch yourself to gain some of the technical knowledge as you're working on this book?
So that was part of the fun for me. That wasn't work, that was fun. To get a chance to just follow curiosity about different things. I love that. And of course, it's relevant to things on Earth that I care about. So, for example, if you ask the question, how will people create energy on Mars? Well, we have to find a new way of creating energy here on this planet. So those things just I'm interested in those things on Earth, and then the chance to explore how it might work on Mars. And a great thing about all of that is that it's so easy to do the research now. The internet makes it very, very easy to explore those kinds of things. And there's lots of great books about all this. And if people don't know, um, there are passionate, let me say, devout and orthodox believers in Mars colonization. And there are passionate anti-Mars colonization people. And it's fun when you realize that in any specialty, there are people with great passion and a huge amount of knowledge.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, as I mentioned, I spent my summer reading sci-fi, including your book. And one of the books that I read, there was this big debate of like pro Mars colonization or not. So I'm glad you spoke to that because I was curious. As you know, your plot is obviously centered around Mars, but I was wondering if you had that in your mind. Well, maybe we can pivot a little bit, and we've already touched on the fact that this our audience, Writing for Life, is largely comprised of aspiring writers or emerging writers or existing writers, and so from a sort of craft perspective, but also the business side of writing.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious if this process being so different, being a different genre, had any surprises for you or kind of lessons learned? Were there any aha moments? And or do you have advice for people who, I think a lot of faith-based writers do have an interest in switching lanes and having written nonfiction. We have other members of the Writing for Life community who've done that, who've switched lanes. Do you have any advice for anyone who's interested in sort of making that switch or being in both spaces?
Mm. Um, well, I suppose, let me say it like this. The fact that I earned a reasonably good reputation as a nonfiction writer, um, gave me enough sort of capital that I could find a publisher who would trust me to switch lanes. I think something that publishers are very afraid of, if they really like you as a writer, and then you write something that they think is really terrible, they don't want to be in the situation of alienating you. So I think it's one of the reasons they don't want you to switch lanes, because I think they've had enough experience where people weren't good at it. And I was aware that I might try this and fail, right? So just because you're good in one area doesn't mean that you'll succeed in another area. Um, and I think it's also important to remember that publishers have a business and they care about the quality of the writing that they produce, at least all the publishers I've ever dealt with. Um, but even even good writing has to uh, come out in the black. When all the expenses are added up, there has to be more income than expenses, or they go out of business. So um, I think it's important for writers to remember a publisher really doesn't owe you anything. Um, in a sense, they're deciding whether to take a risk on you. And so I bring those that awareness into the business side of it. I'll tell you the biggest thing I would say about the actual fiction writing uh, process. There are people doing great work online. I think it's the Clemens sisters, a lot of people doing really great work, giving people ideas of how to develop characters and how to develop plot and how to do good dialogue. There's so much material out there. And I would encourage people to take advantage of that, take little short courses and learn everything you can from those people. I'll just give you a quick example. My wife was for many years a Myers-Briggs practitioner. So as I was developing the characters, I figured out what their Myers-Briggs type was. And then also I'm a fan of the Enneagram. So I figured out where I'd put them on the Enneagram. Well, just doing that in my mind helped
Um,
me in imagining these characters and what they would do. That's a little trick, that really can help people, I think, develop characters that have some amount of coherence. Um, uh, I did not uh, have a detailed plot outline when I began.
oh,
Um,
interesting.
I, I would recommend people do if they possibly can. But as I said, my approach to both nonfiction and fiction has always been sort of experimental. So I threw away a lot. I would, develop something and think, I don't like how this is going. And I had to be willing to, cut 20,000 words and back up and then go in a different direction. Um, and I was willing to do that. I don't have a big emotional attachment if I have to send something to the trash file. So, uh, but other people I think would be smart to develop those outlines. And even if you have to adjust them if you go along, that's okay. But yeah. But what was fun for me is partly figuring out what was going to happen as it went along. That I don't recommend that for everybody, but that was my,
So it's an
um,
exploration as
yeah,
you're writing The Last Voyage.
yeah,
Well, and just back to the sort of the writing and the business of being a writer. I'm curious how, I know the book has only been out for about a month and a half. How is it being received? And when I ask that, I mean, um, by your readers. Do you feel
yeah.
like the book is reaching a different population, or do you feel like your kind of loyal readership is coming along with you for the ride, so to speak, or both?
Yes. So if folks want to, this is actually in the public record, so people could actually do this. I did this several weeks ago, so it might be very different now. But Goodreads sends out manuscripts to people. And so I went and read all the reviews on the Goodreads site. So most of these are people who'd never heard of me. They did it because of their connection to Goodreads. And so um, what was very interesting to me is watching the people who didn't like it, um, uh, and thinking, first of all, thinking, how did you ever interpret it that way? But one of the things you have to get used to is that not everybody's going to like what you do. Novels that I love, other people hate. And so we have to sort of be aware that not everybody's going to like it. And I think in fiction, maybe even more than nonfiction, you kind of have to have a thick skin, um, because some people just won't like what you do. But what has been super encouraging to me is both people who've been familiar with my work, the feedback I've gotten from them, and the people who are totally unfamiliar with my work, to find how they get it and it resonates with them. Um, One quick story: someone who read an early version of the book, a friend sent an email and said, "I was in a very difficult organizational meeting today, and we had to do something really difficult as an organization. And all I could think of through the meeting is, what would Eve do?" So she said, your character got into my head. And she said, now I'm home, relaxing, sitting on the back deck, and a bunch of birds are singing. So I opened up a bird app and thought, Colfax would know the name of these birds. So she said, your characters have gotten into my head. And that was, yeah, that was a nice thing to hear.
Well, that's really so wonderful. And I agree. I mean, there was just a moment, I read a few chapters and then there was, that moment when when you're reading a novel, when you get invested, when you
Mm,
start caring and the sort of energy of the story
yeah.
and your investment in the characters grips you to such a point that you are being carried by the book and you're committed to reading it. And I felt that maybe, chapter 4 or 5, like
Mm,
especially with the Eve and Colfax dynamic.
mm.
So I concur. Your characters are really, and your writing is great. So as I've said before, so congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Well, maybe, I want to ask you about sort of I know this is part of a trilogy and I want to ask you about the coming books. But before I do, I just want to ask if there was a favorite character or favorite
Mm.
part of the book to write. What was the most fun in this whole process? Or maybe it's
Yes.
talking to readers too. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, actually, I, I, I know my answer to that question as soon as you ask it, and that is, obviously, Eve and Colfax are two main characters, but especially as the trilogy unfolds, what I hope people get to feel is that the protagonist of the story is not an individual, but the protagonist is a team. And that people start to feel that the individuals really don't exist apart from the community, the team. They're all facets of the team. They're individuals, but the team is so real. And letting that sort of interconnection of the team members play itself out in my mind, I think I think I don't know if that's aspirational for me, but I think this is one of our challenges, is we have been so well trained to see ourselves as individuals, we forget how embedded we are, in a team. And something for a voyage of people where you have something called minimum viable population, which means if you don't have a certain number of people contributing their genes to a reproducing group, with enough genetic diversity, this community will fail. And the thought that there would be people who would be at the end of a failed experiment is a terrifying thought. That's one of the thoughts that sent shivers up my spine as I wrote the book. Um, but it means you can't throw anybody away. You have to find a way to reconnect after there have been breaks and breaches, um, and so that was, I think, my favorite thing.
Well, that's great, and that really resonates. And as you were speaking, I it made me curious. Do you feel like this plot line, this team dynamic got in your imagination and under your skin in a way
Mm,
that perhaps writing nonfiction hasn't? Like,
mm,
do you lie in bed at night or, wake up in the morning and think about these characters, or did you as you were working on the books, in a different way from writing nonfiction? Or do
yes,
you think it's just a different, it's the same thing, but it's different? You're still struggling with ideas. But again, if it's character based, I
yeah.
imagine that your imagination gets keyed in a different way. Is that true?
I think it does. I mean, I when I'm working on a nonfiction book, one thing I would tell writers is, um, let's say that you have a year to write a book, or you have 6 months to write a book. I'd like to have a year, because just the fact when you're doing a nonfiction book that this is your subject, your brain becomes like a magnet and all these things stick to it. If you weren't writing that book, you wouldn't even notice them. But because you're writing that book and you're dealing with that set of problems, things just, you notice them, and then they enrich the book, right? There's the writing process is a hunter-gatherer process, and you're aware of things in that way. So I think there is a wonderful way that works in nonfiction. But in fiction, um, I think there are two things that have kind of been very alive and exciting for me in this process, which is still ongoing. The third book is still in process. And one is the characters, what is happening to them, what could go wrong for them, what is trying to get born in them, what's trying to develop and grow in them. And then the other is the plot, because um, in the third novel that I'm working on right now, I've been at a sort of a roadblock in the plot. I knew something needed to happen, and any way I solved that problem, I didn't like. And the other day, I was taking a walk outdoors, and a solution came to a way. I had to back up and throw out a few things, but if I realized if I made this happen instead of this happen, it could open up new possibilities. So both the characters and the plot have a way of waking you up in the middle of the night or catching your attention as you're taking a walk.
I'm curious from your creative process, did that aha moment happen in a moment of relaxation when you weren't
Yes,
thinking about it?
yes, very much
Wow.
so. Very much so.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So interesting
yeah.
the way our minds work. Well, tell us a little bit about the trajectory of the trilogy.
Yes.
Yeah, and just, a little bit about book two and book three so we know what to look forward to.
So the last voyage starts with the recruitment phase of uh, a group of people to go to Mars, and it takes you through the first third of the voyage to Mars. A voyage to Mars would probably take about 9 months, and it kind of is a nice number to work with all of the other meanings of 9 months. So there are three trimesters. So um, the second novel is called The Great Rift, and it begins in the second 3 month period. You get through the voyage and the first 9 months or so of life on Mars for this new group of people joining the colony that's already there. And as the title suggests, the Great Rift, um, what you discover in book two is that a deep, deep rift has happened in this colony that has to do with issues that have been brought from Earth. So that's probably all I should say about that. And I'm super happy with how that book ends. Um, and the third book takes place 30 years later. It's called Ethnogenesis. And what happens there is that this colony on Mars regains contact with some people on Earth. They've had no contact for these 30 years. And they in some ways get to compare notes. how are you surviving there? How are we surviving here? Um, and in two different kinds of harsh environments, one a very harsh physical environment and the other a very harsh social, political, economic environment.
Well, thank you, Brian. And maybe just as a final question before I sort of ask you where we can find the books and when the next one's coming out and all that good stuff. What do you hope, if your wildest dreams were to come true, what would your hopes be for this book in terms of impact? And I know that's hard to say, and part of the impact, I'm sure is what you've already discussed, is that these books allowed you to extrapolate kind of from where we are here and sort of think about it through for yourself. But just in terms of our public discourse, our sort of decision making, we're obviously in such difficult and divisive times right
Mm.
now. How do you hope that your sci-fi books
Mm.
would contribute to that conversation or perhaps even move the needle a little bit?
Yeah, Kate, it is very hard for any book, fiction or nonfiction, to break through. The number of fantastic books that very few people ever read. I remember an agent once said to me that she was thinking about quitting. And I said, why? And she said, because there is absolutely no correlation between how good a book it is and how well it sells. And she said, I've been working at this for so long, and I'm just getting so discouraged by all the great books that don't sell them any, and all the trashy books that sell a lot. So I think all of us who are writers have to, if we're going to survive, we've got to sell well enough that, publishers still think we're worth taking a risk on. But uh, I don't think too much in terms of numbers and that sort of thing these days. I want it to do as well as it needs to do. Um, but when the trilogy of books is out, I suppose what I hope, first of all, I hope that younger people can read it, because describing the next 60 years of history are the 60 years they're going to be living through. And I hope it would be a useful book for young people in thinking about what their how they will show up for the future of the times that they live in.
Well, thank you for that. I have a 19-year-old daughter in college, so I'm going to give my copy to her.
Oh, great.
So
Oh,
she'll be
great.
part of that cohort.
That makes me
Um,
happy.
well, Brian, tell us where, I'm assuming we can find the book everywhere books are
Yeah,
sold, but
yeah,
just tell us a little bit about where we can find more of your work in general, and also when the second book in the trilogy is coming out,
yeah.
because
So
I'm ready.
so people can find out everything about me at my website, brianmclaren.net. And there are links to social media and many, many years of archives from my blog and links to the podcasts they do and things like that. So that's all there. Um, and the second book, The Great Rift, it will be out sometime in the next probably 12 to 18 months. I don't have a date yet. We're still working on that. And I think the third one will be out in a shorter time span after that. So the second and third should come out pretty quickly.
Well, thank you. And before I let you go, I'm just going to ask you one more question as a writer.
Yes.
As I was just looking at you, the word that came to mind is brave. That this is a
Mm.
very brave thing to do, to put your neck out to write such a great book.
Mhm.
Um, it strikes me as brave, and I'm curious, has it felt scary, more scary or less scary than other things you've written?
Mm.
Is it just kind of from an emotional landscape? How is publishing this book felt different than others, if at all?
Well, that's a good question. I'll give you a very short answer, but I really would like to think about that question myself. Uh, when my first book came out, I remember saying to my wife, when this book comes out, I'm going to lose at least half of my friends. And and there has been some courage involved. I was writing for a religious audience, and religious audiences tend to love you if you say what they want to hear, and they tend to punish you if you don't. So there was a certain kind of stress from that world. I learned how to stretch envelopes and I also learned how to say goodbye to some readers and say hello to new readers. So that's part of the process. I've watched several young writers, people we both know, who I've watched them have to become braver people. And it is part of the writing process, as you know. It takes courage. It takes courage to put yourself out there in any way. And then especially when you're trying to put yourself out there in ways that you think will stretch people, that takes some courage. Um, this book uh, just took courage because I took a different kind of courage, breaking into a new field. Uh, you don't know if you'll be ignored or if you'll be accepted. So um, uh, that, there's worse things than being criticized. That's being ignored. So it's nice to have some people pay attention.
So does this mean you're going to be at sci-fi book conferences and, you know,
Hey, if I got asked, I would love it. That would really be fun.
great. Well, maybe people will dress up as your characters,
Oh, there you go. There you go. I like that. I
like a
like
Star
that.
Trek convention or, something like that. So I'll come as Eve or Colfax. So,
Okay,
well,
that sounds
Brian,
good.
congratulations on the launch of your first sci-fi novel, The Last Voyage. Again, it's been such a treat to read it. Really engaging, engrossing, and challenging. So I want to thank you and congratulate you for all of your incredible work and for continuing to be a public voice, talking about difficult, painful, and critically important issues. So thank you for all you do.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and yeah, I look forward to keeping this conversation going.
Great. Well, keep us posted on how it goes, and I can't wait to read book number 2. So thanks again and blessings.
Thank you. Thank you.